The Christian faces a fundamental dilemma. Does his faith permit him to fight for his country? Christianity is a religion rooted in peace, while war brings about killing and devastation. The early church fathers had no hesitation in their view. However, after Christianity triumphed and the empire itself became Christendom, the question arose whether its citizens should be willing to take up arms to protect it. The Eastern Church believed otherwise. Its prominent canonist, Saint Basil, acknowledged that soldiers were bound to obey their orders, yet insisted that anyone who killed in battle should abstain from communion for 3 years as a sign of repentance. This standard proved too severe in practice. Byzantine soldiers were not treated as murderers, but their role brought little honor. Death in battle was not seen as glorious, nor was dying while fighting non-Christians considered martyrdom. True martyrs died armed only with faith. Fighting the infidel was regrettable, though sometimes unavoidable, while engaging in war against fellow Christians was viewed as even more reprehensible. In fact, Byzantine history shows a notable absence of wars driven by aggression. Justinian's campaigns aimed to liberate Romans from heretical barbarian rulers, and Basil II's wars against the Bulgars sought to reclaim imperial provinces and eliminate threats to Constantinople. Diplomatic solutions, even if complex or costly, were always preferred. To Western historians who admire military valor, many Byzantine leaders might seem cowardly or cunning, but their primary motivation was often a sincere desire to avoid bloodshed. Anna Komnena, one of the most representative Byzantines, illustrates in her writings that, though deeply interested in military affairs and proud of her father's victories, she regarded war as shameful, a last resort, signifying failure when all other measures had failed. In contrast, the Western perspective was less restrained. Saint Augustine acknowledged that wars could be fought by divine command, and the militaristic culture that evolved in the West after the barbarian invasions naturally sought to legitimize its violent tendencies. The emerging chivalric code, supported by popular epics, glorified the military hero, while pacifists earned a lasting reputation for cowardice. The Church could do little to counter this mindset. Instead, it sought to channel martial zeal in ways that served its interests. Thus, the concept of holy war became acceptable, even commendable. In the mid-9th century, Pope Leo IV proclaimed that those who died defending the Church would be rewarded in heaven. A few years later, Pope John VIII declared that those who perished in holy wars would be regarded as martyrs, their sins forgiven if they died in battle. However, these soldiers were expected to maintain purity of heart. Nicholas I decreed that men under church censure for their sins should not bear arms, except when fighting non-believers. Although the highest church authorities did not outright forbid warfare, there were Western thinkers who found it deeply disturbing. Bruno of Erfurt, a German martyred by pagan Prussians in 1009, was appalled by the wars waged by the emperors of his era against fellow Christians. A movement advocating peace had already begun in France. At the Council of Charroux in 989, where the bishops of Aquitaine gathered to defend clerical immunity, the idea emerged that the Church should ensure that the poor could live in safety. The following year, at the Council of Le Puy, this proposal was reiterated with greater resolve. Guy of Anjou, Bishop of Le Puy, emphasized that without peace, no one could see the Lord, and therefore urged everyone to become children of peace. A few years later, William the Great, Duke of Guienne, advanced the concept further. At the Council of Poitiers in 1000, it was decreed that disputes should be settled through legal means rather than by violence, and that those who defied this decree would face excommunication. The Duke and his nobles formally agreed to these terms, and Robert the Pious, King of France, established a similar rule within his own realm. While the Church's primary concern remained the protection of its lands and properties from the devastation of war, numerous councils were convened to reinforce this objective. At Verdun-sur-Doubs in 1016, a formula was established by which nobles swore not to conscript clergy or peasants into their armies, not to raid crops, and not to seize livestock. This oath was widely taken throughout France, accompanied by the resounding chant of priests and congregants. Peace, peace, peace. Emboldened by this success, some zealous bishops sought to take more drastic steps. In 1038, Aymon, Archbishop of Bourges, commanded that every Christian over the age of 15 declare themselves an enemy of those who broke the peace and be prepared to fight against them if necessary. Leagues of peace were formed and initially proved effective. However, the second part of the archbishop's directive became far more appealing than the first. Armed bands of peasants, led by clergy, attacked and destroyed castles of defiant nobles. But these militias soon turned reckless and destructive, forcing the authorities to intervene and disband them. After a major league of peace set fire to the village of Benicy, Count Odo of Dales confronted and defeated them on the banks of the Cher River. Reports claim that no fewer than 700 clerics died in the battle. At the same time, a more pragmatic effort was underway to restrict the practice of warfare. In 1027, Alaba, Bishop of Vich, convened a synod at Toulouse in Roussillon, where it was decreed that fighting should cease during the hours of the Sabbath. This concept of suspending hostilities on sacred days was soon expanded. Influenced by the great abbot of Cluny, Odilo, the bishops of Provence, speaking on behalf of the entire Church of Gaul, addressed a letter in 1041 to the Church in Italy, proposing that the Truce of God be extended to include Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Ascension Day. The Church of Aquitaine had already adopted similar measures. Burgundy went even further, instituting a truce that covered the period from Wednesday evening to Monday morning each week, as well as the entire time from Advent until the first Sunday after Epiphany, and from Lent through Holy Week to the octave of Easter. In 1042, William the Conqueror, legislating for Normandy, expanded the truce to include the days from the Rogation period until the octave of Pentecost. By 1050, a council at Toulouse recommended adding the 3 feast days dedicated to the Virgin Mary and the major saints' days. By the middle of the 11th century, the concept of the Truce of God had become widely accepted. The Great Council of Narbonne in 1054 sought to integrate it with the peace of God, which aimed to protect church property and the possessions of the poor from the ravages of war. Both the truce and the peace were to be enforced under penalty of excommunication, and it was explicitly declared that no Christian should kill another, for he who kills a Christian spills the blood of Christ. In practice, peace movements often fall short of their lofty ideals, and the efforts of the 11th century were no exception. Many princes who had vocally supported the Truce of God disregarded its rules. William the Conqueror, for example, fought against his fellow Christian, Harold, at Hastings on a Saturday. Anna Comnena would later express her horror that while her own church sincerely sought to avoid conflict on holy days, Western knights dared to attack Constantinople during Holy Week, their armies even including armed and combat-ready priests. The popes, too, were well aware that church lands remained vulnerable to attacks by lay rulers. The West's love of battle and its admiration for military glory could not easily be subdued. It seemed more practical to return to earlier policies, channeling this restless energy into wars against non-Christians. For the Western realms, the Muslim threat appeared far more severe than it had to the Byzantines, at least before the Turkish invasions. To the Byzantines, the Turks were alarming primarily as barbarians, rather than as infidels. Since the failure of the Arab siege of Constantinople in the early 8th century, warfare along the eastern frontier of Christendom had been frequent, but not seriously threatening to the empire's stability, nor did it significantly disrupt commercial or intellectual exchanges. Arabs, like Byzantines, were inheritors of Greco-Roman civilization, and their lifestyles were not so dissimilar. A Byzantine would often feel more at home in Cairo or Baghdad than in Paris, Goslar, or even Rome. Except during rare crises or retaliatory periods, the authorities of both the empire and the caliphate generally refrained from forced conversions and allowed freedom of worship. Although boastful caliphs might sometimes belittle the Christian emperors or demand tribute, the Byzantines, as demonstrated in the late 10th century, remained a powerful and highly organized adversary. The Western Christian did not share the Byzantines' tolerance or sense of security. He took pride in being a Christian and considered himself the successor to Rome, yet he was uncomfortably aware that, in many ways, Muslim civilization surpassed his own. Muslim power dominated the western Mediterranean, stretching from Catalonia to Tunis. Muslim pirates targeted Christian shipping, and Rome itself had been sacked by Muslim forces. They had constructed fortresses in Italy and Provence, and from their strongholds in Spain, it seemed possible that they might again cross the frontiers and sweep over the Pyrenees into France. Western Christendom lacked the organization necessary to repel such an invasion. Since the time of Charles Martel, individual leaders had successfully repelled Saracen raids, and for a period, the Carolingian Empire had provided a stable defense. In 915, Pope John X, working alongside the court of Constantinople, organized an alliance of Christian rulers to expel the Muslims from their stronghold on the Garigliano River. In 941, the Byzantines joined forces with Hugh of Provence in an assault on their fortress at Frejus. This effort failed due to Hugh's sudden change of mind. However, in 972, a coalition of Provençal and Italian princes finally succeeded in destroying the Muslim presence there. These alliances, however, were isolated, sporadic, and short-lived. There was a pressing need for more extensive coordination and a sustained campaign. Meanwhile, the monastery of Cluny began to take a growing interest in Spanish affairs. Abbot Odilo, who died in 1048, and his successor Hugh, who led until 1109, devoted special attention to Spain. Cluny had long been concerned with the well-being of pilgrims and welcomed any opportunity to oversee the pilgrimage routes to Compostela and contribute to the defense of Spanish Christendom. It was likely through Cluniac influence that Roger of Tosny, driven partly by Norman ambition, came from Normandy to assist Countess Erskine of Barcelona in 1018 when Muslim forces threatened her lands. Under Sancho and his successors, Cluny's influence over the Spanish church expanded, drawing it into the broader movement for reform. The papacy naturally regarded any efforts to expand Christian territory in Spain with particular favor. Cluniac and papal support accompanied Sancho William of Gascony when he allied with Sancho of Navarre in an offensive against the Emir of Saragossa. They likewise encouraged Raymond Berenguer I of Barcelona as he advanced southward, pushing Muslim forces back and extending Christian control. The war against the infidels in Spain gradually took on the character of a holy war, and soon the popes themselves became directly involved in its leadership. In 1063, as King Ramiro I of Aragon was launching a major offensive against the Muslims, he was assassinated by a Muslim at Grados. His death captured the imagination of Christian Europe. Pope Alexander II immediately offered indulgences to all who fought for the cross in Spain and began organizing an army to continue Ramiro's campaign. William of Montreuil, a Norman soldier in the Pope's service, gathered troops in northern Italy. In northern France, Count Eblis of Roussy, brother to Queen Felicia of Aragon, raised another force, while the largest contingent was led by Guy Geoffrey, Count of Aquitaine, who assumed command of the expedition. Despite these efforts, little progress was made. The town of Barbastro was taken and a great deal of booty secured, but it was soon lost again. Nevertheless, French knights continued to cross the Pyrenees to join the struggle. In 1073, Eblis of Roussy organized a new expedition. Pope Gregory VII called on Christian princes to take part, asserting that the Spanish kingdom was under the authority of St. Peter's See and declaring that Christian knights were entitled to keep the lands they seized from the infidels. In 1078, Hugh I, Duke of Burgundy, led an army to assist his brother-in-law, Alfonso VI of Castile. 2 years later, Gregory VII personally endorsed another expedition under the leadership of Guy Geoffrey. For a time, Christian forces made significant gains. The Castilians captured Toledo in 1085. However, a Muslim resurgence followed, led by the fervent Almoravids. From 1087 onward, Christian knights were urgently summoned to Spain to resist this renewed threat. Pope Urban II offered his full support, even advising pilgrims who had intended to journey to Palestine to instead spend their resources rebuilding Spanish towns reclaimed from Muslim control. Throughout the remainder of the century, these Spanish campaigns continued to attract adventurous knights from northern Europe, culminating in the capture of Huesca in 1096 and Barbastro once more in 1101, bringing this phase of the conflict to a close. By the end of the 11th century, the concept of holy war had become a reality. Christian knights and soldiers were urged by the Church to abandon their internal conflicts and travel to the frontiers of Christendom to fight the infidel. In return, they were allowed to claim the lands they liberated and were granted spiritual rewards. The exact nature of these spiritual benefits remains somewhat unclear. Alexander II appears to have offered indulgences to those who joined the 1064 campaign, while Gregory VII promised absolution to those who died fighting for the cross. He had previously offered similar absolution to the soldiers of Rudolph of Swabia, who battled against the excommunicated Henry IV of Germany. The papacy was increasingly assuming leadership over these holy wars. Although many of the great princes tended to keep their distance, Western knights eagerly answered the call to the holy war. Their motivations were partly rooted in sincere religious conviction. They were ashamed of their constant internal conflicts and longed to fight instead for the cross. Yet, there was also a strong desire for land, particularly in northern France, where the system of primogeniture was becoming increasingly common. As lords became more reluctant to divide their estates, and the offices associated with them younger sons were forced to seek their fortunes elsewhere. A spirit of restlessness and adventure permeated the knightly class in France, especially among the Normans, who were only a few generations removed from their freebooting ancestors. The prospect of fulfilling one's Christian duty while also acquiring land in a southern climate held great appeal. The Church, observing the enthusiasm and progress of the movement, found cause for satisfaction. Might not this same approach be applied to the eastern frontier of Christendom as well?